Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Penang Institute. So today we are honored to have Professor Houston Kwa, so the Albert Winsemius Chair Professor of Economics at NTU, National Technology University in Singapore, to share with us the Dutch connections to Singapore and how Penang can learn from Albert Winsemius. So let me read the short versions of his bio. So Professor Kwa is also the director of the Economy Growth Center at NTU, where he formerly headed the economics department for 15 years. He is uniquely experienced and led the economics departments at National University of Singapore as well. A prolific, well-cited author with over 100 articles and 20 books, Professor Kwa is a global expert in cost-benefit analysis. He advises various ministries and international bodies, holding key roles on numerous boards and councils in Singapore. His vast contributions to economics and society earned him NTU's Albert Winsemius Chair and Singapore's Public Administration's Silver Medal. He authored a biography on Albert Winsemius and his connections to Singapore. Today, we are pleased to have Professor Kwa, who will be telling us about the learning from Albert Winsemius and the connections to Singapore, and also illustrate in the case of Penang. So without much further ado, please welcome Professor Kwa.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, I'm very delighted to be here again. I mean, some of you, I recognize faces in the audience who have come to my earlier talks in Penang. Now, most of you may not know, but Penang is my hometown, and I've come back. And every time when I come back to see my classmates, my friends, family, so I make it a point to contact the Penang Institute and see whether they'll be interested in some of the talks I give. Anyway, today's talk is actually not about Penang. So some of you may come with the expectation that I will be talking about how to make Penang prosperous, how to make Penang grow very fast. But I'm actually not a Penang watcher. I mean, like you, I probably read from papers and see what's from time to time how Penang is doing, and also I'm not really truly a Singapore watcher as well. But let me just tell you why I wrote the book, and also I think it's useful to know this person. Many people do not know that Singapore's early days actually benefited a lot from the contribution of a Dutch economist, and his name is Dr. Albert Winsemius. And basically, Singapore in 1960, they were looking for an advisor on industrialization of Singapore. 1960, Singapore was very young. It was a backwater place. So they managed to find this person through interaction, perhaps with him, during overseas trips, conferences, by the then Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, who is often credited as being the father of modern Singapore, and the economy aspects. And also, I think he has met the former Minister of Finance, Mr. Hon Swee Sen. And so arising from the brief introduction and so on, so when Singapore is looking for an advisor to assist in this industrialization program, so immediately they contacted the United Nations Development Program, and they sent a team headed by Dr. Albert Winsemius. So how did I become interested in Albert Winsemius? Well, in 2019, when I was enjoying part of my leave, my sabbatical leave in Japan, so I received a phone call from my university president, Subra Suresh, and informing me that I have been appointed the Albert Winsemius chair. So I'm the third chair of Albert Winsemius, holding that title. So naturally, of course, I was very pleased, very happy. And then it dawned on me how little I know about Albert Winsemius. So having that chair's name spurs me to find out more about Albert Winsemius. And it quite amazes me that not many people really know much about Albert Winsemius. So the work of Albert Winsemius has been found in sporadically everywhere, like newspaper articles, like some people's writing chapters in books, but they are not found in one comprehensive publication, which deals specifically on the contributions by Albert Winsemius. And let me I think by the end of this talk, there are two things that will happen here. One is that you will understand much better about this contribution to Singapore and how it aided Singapore's growth, economic growth. And then I will also talk about the second part, which is how our information and the contributions from Albert Winsemius can in some ways also be useful for Penang's continued growth and development. So in many ways, Penang and Singapore are quite similar, being both island states, and the land scarce, right? And the type of economy when the earlier years, right? So there are a lot of things in terms of comparison. I'm going to talk about this. But the main caveat that I have here today is I am not going to answer questions that in very detail, how do you think should Penang do this or not? Because that means that I have good knowledge exactly on the micro aspects of Penang, which I don't have. So I'm just going to talk about Albert Winsemius and how his ideas, how his suggestions can benefit Penang. Okay. So I think now I will use the slides which I have sent over. Do we have the clicker? Okay. So the key insight here is that Penang can draw lessons, right, from Albert Winsemius' pragmatic, long-term, and inclusive approach to Singapore's development, particularly in areas of industrial policy, human capital development, urban planning, to position itself as a modern, competitive, livable city. And I'll expand on this. So this is the book that I was talking about. I wanted to bring the book, but the book is about 1,000 pages. So it's a very thick book, hard copy, hard for me to carry without losing all the space I need for other things to bring. So because when I started working on it, there is so much work involved that I totally underestimated, right? The amount of research needed. Also, research. And archives research also involves not just Singapore, but also where Dr. Albert Winsemius came from, which is the Netherlands, right? And involves interviews with people who know Albert Winsemius. People, some of them are still alive in Singapore today, but some have sadly passed away. And so as I proceeded on the work, I realized it's beyond one person to do this. So I roped in my two assistants, my research associates, Luke and Zach, to help me out. And then I credited them as a co-author for this volume. So I just want to acknowledge their. Now this book cover is significant. You will see that this painting is actually a painting. And this is a swamp area. So when Albert Winsemius went to Singapore, and he surveyed some sites as to, where Singapore's industrial development will take place and so on. So he came across a small hilltop, and he looked across and he saw this picture, this image. And then he said, here it is going to happen. So he saw this and he said, here it's going to happen. That's why the book title is Albert Winsemius in Singapore, Here It Is Going to Happen. And he had in his expedition, this guy called Dr. Karl Franz, a member of his team, and he was an amateur painter. And he took the trouble to paint this picture. So very soon, this picture then set in Albert Winsemius' home in the Netherlands for a long time. He passed away in 1997, and the picture was in his home. Then this picture was bequeathed to the Economic Development Board in Singapore, where it sat in the boardroom, right? An overview of this whole project was, it covers the biography on Albert Winsemius' life, Netherlands, prior to his arrival. It examines his affinity with Singapore and his contributions to the country's economic growth. It looks at his legacy and his past influence on current and future economy planners. So I was interested in the 6 questions when the book project began. So here are the 6 questions. So what are the major contributions? Question 2, did Albert Winsemius follow any economic development literature of the time? What was economic status of Singapore in the 1960s when he arrived? And what was the status when he left in the 1980s? Were there synergies between Albert Winsemius and Singapore's leaders of the time, Lee Kuan Yew and Dr. Goh Keng Swee? Did Albert Winsemius have anything to do with the idea of sustainable development at all? Because not much has been written about that aspect, but which we are now very concerned about. And what do we know about the life and the career of Albert Winsemius before and after Singapore? Now, this book also contains these specially invited contributions of on Albert Winsemius' biography in the Netherlands. It looks at reminiscences of people who knows him, worked with him, and it gathers the views from experts of the keen watchers of the Singapore economy. And lastly, the heritage trail of places that Albert Winsemius had visited during his time when he came to Singapore over 24 years. So he has a habit, for example, to visit factories, bicycle shops. And why did he do that? Because he was interested to see how people work of that time. Do they have the productivity, tenacity? All these things he noted down. And he came to the conclusion that, yes, Singapore at that time has the prerequisite for Singapore to take off. So this part I've already explained why this book, right? And this person is the former president of NTU. It was also written in conjunction with the 60th anniversary of Singapore's Economic Development Board. Okay, so this one I don't have to go through. So this is how it started from this hotel in Netherlands, and he got the message to come to Singapore, and he came. And the Straits Times article published in 1960 said, titled "United Nations meant to study industrial potential." In 61, Winsemius, together with his chosen team, came for a second mission after 1960. And then from 61 to 1983, he began his regular visits to Singapore at least 2-3 times a year. And he would stay on for about 2 weeks. So these are some photographs of when Albert Winsemius was young. to teenager days, and so on and so forth until he came to Singapore. That was how it is. Now, Albert Winsemius, I mean, he's an economist, but during World War II, he was also working as making sure food prices as a controller of prices. And after the war, he also served in the Dutch government as looking after the economy, the Dutch economic recovery during that period. He was a contributor as well. So the book has basically three parts. The first part I've just dealt with. Second part dealt with the lessons, right? You know, this is an interesting quote from him, which I want to read out. I attended 2 meetings and got fed up with it because it was only talk, talk, talk. And for the rest, nothing happens, right? Nothing. So I wrote to the minister, sorry, you better appoint somebody else. This tells you that he is a doer. He's not just going to attend meetings and listen to talks. He wants. So, okay. So the other thing is that there, of course, at that time in the 60s, there were leading economic development theories around. All right. And did Albert Winsemius follow the leading economic development theory of the time? And from my research, we found out that he was very eclectic, meaning that he doesn't follow any particular model. He was not ideologist, you know. So he's more interested in what works and how can we custom made some of the suggested solutions, remedies, right, for a particular country. There's no one size fits all. So these are things that come with him. He's a very pragmatic person, not caught up with the theoretical arguments of the time. So these are the leading players of the time, you know, like Keynes, Curie, Gabriel, Sir Arthur Lewis. This won the Nobel Prize, right? People. He also, from his work, one would be able to tell why his kind of method and approach to development works compared to the more theoretically famous people in the world. And that is embodied in this word pragmatism, which in the book we call it Winsemian pragmatism. And I'm going to explain a little bit more as we carry on this talk. Now, in the book, we also postulate how Albert Winsemius could have used today, it's very popular, behavioral economics. And my own kind of work on cost-benefit analysis, using it as a tool for him to understand and to advise economic activities. Okay, so Winsemius' development strategy is custom-made for Singapore from all these models, theories, and so on, custom-made, right? And part 3, we are interested in retrospections. Now, this is another quote from him. The moment we are satisfied with ourselves, applaud ourselves, then our growth will wind down. If you sit on what you have, you get nothing extra. Very meaningful statement that he made. So to understand this particular aspect of him, you know, people may not be aware that unemployment in Singapore in the 60s is almost 30%. Can you imagine unemployment at 30%? So he was naturally concerned about how to reduce this massive unemployment. So one quick way is to get people to find work quickly. And so he came up with many ideas, like instead of being always focusing on the entrepreneur trade, he talked about and he actually advocated ship repair, shipbuilding, breaking up of ship parts, you know. and salvage them for many users. In fact, the steel parts that were removed from the ships ended up for the steel and iron mill in Singapore, and also the beginning of the HDB housing estates in Singapore. Some of the steel parts came from this ship breaking. But why ship breaking? Because ship breaking, ship repair takes up a lot of employment of people. So that's something that's a quick way, And the point is that by the end of the 60s, so the 60s is a period of concern with unemployment. By the end of the 60s, they have reached almost full employment. And then basically, he told the government that we must now switch the focus. So we have attained more or less full employment. The next stage is to try to raise this to a higher value added economy, raise productivity. And so he thinks that the wage rates that we have from the 60s are still is low. And so we must do something to this wage rate and then send a signal to all the employers and people that we are now changing to a different kind of economy. And so there was a recommendation that there should be a wage catch-up. And he moved it to almost 20% of wage increase for the next 3 years at the end of 1960s. And that was shocking because, people are afraid, including the then founding prime minister, was very concerned. And then naturally so, suddenly the wage goes up very high. I think it was almost second to Japan. It's a huge jump. So what would happen? But he was convinced that the only way to turn Singapore into a different type of economy, more higher value, right? So you need to move these wages up and then compel or send the signal to all the employers that that's what we are going to do next, right? And that's what he did, and that comes with trying to reduce this over reliance on foreign labor. Because when you have too many foreign labor coming to your country, then the wage rate is depressed. You don't get an easy supply of workers, so the wage rate is low, and so a lot of unskilled workers. This is something which we see today, not any different. We are still concerned about this excess foreign supply coming in and making the wage rate low. As long as the wage rate is kept low or suppressed, right, then they will be very difficult to move up the productivity or to compel a switch. For example, replacing workers with machines, right? We're trying to use more technological stuff, right? So it'll be stuck in a labor-intensive economy for all the time. So that's not good. Now, this is a story about Sentosa, which is called Pulau Belakang Mati at that time. That's an interesting story because I was being an environmental economist. I was interested to see whether Albert Winsemius, how does he feel about growing the economy and yet protecting the environment? Are there traces of evidence where he was concerned about environment? And there were. So one clear case is the Sentosa Island, which I know all of you know Sentosa Island, right, in Singapore. But how many of you would know that it was earmarked to be a refinery island? Oil refinery, petrochemicals, and all those things, right? So during the time when it was agreed with ESSO that this island will be earmarked for such kind of activities, when Albert Winsemius found out about this, he was very upset. And then he tried to convince the Dr. Goh Keng Swee to not to have it. But then but this has already been sort of agreed upon with ESSO, right? So what he did was he flew to New York and then he talked to the ESSO bosses there to why not take another island, Jurong Island, for example. And he argued that it is no real cost to ESSO, but it's a real gain to Singapore. And that arises because we don't want, well, there are several reasons he gave. One is that he envisaged that in years to come, Singapore will be a wealthier country, become a wealthy country. And so they will need places for recreation and leisure. And land is also very scarce in Singapore. So he said this island will be ideal for such purpose. So that's his explanation number one. The second reason he said was that this is too near a town area, this island, right? And we have in economics the concept of not in my backyard, which means that everybody feels it's very important to have a facility next to them. It could be airport, it could be a landfill, it could be a factory. All these are important for the country's economic growth. But as long as you don't cite that facility next to where I live. So if you ask me, should the country have these facilities? I 100% say yes. But make sure you don't put it next to me. So in the economics literature, it's called NIMBYs, NIMBYS, not in my backyard. It's a whole research behind this. So in the case of this Sentosa Island, it's the same thing. It's too near the proximity to town area. So it's not good to have it there, right? And that's why he suggested that we should move it further south, right? And that's how we end up today, with Jurong Island, Pulau Bukom, all these places, not in Sentosa. So in a sense, he saves Sentosa from being turned into a refinery island. So some of these key strategies that he also proposed to the government at that time. One is like export-oriented industrialization. Many of the countries at that time, in the 60s, they were thinking of import substitution strategies. So they make their own and so on. And that leads to, for example, infant industry, overprotection of these infant industries. And the other thing is that he welcomed Singapore to be sort of networking with the world, being open for business for the world as well, and so on. Very outward looking, right? Outward looking. That's very different from other countries that they want to produce their own goods, for example, and there's also some protectionism going on at the time, and they're setting up barriers that protect their own local industries, and also the fear of multinational companies. So at that time, many countries are very frightened of MNCs. But he said, no, MNCs is also key to Singapore's growth and development. Let's welcome them, right? So there are his ideas is very different from the less developed countries of the time. Very open, very global in the outlook. Then he talks about this for public housing, building urban infrastructure, investment in education and skills. He basically say that universities should not just turn out theories. He must also look at real world problems and issues. And so what's the point of having a good industrialization policy growing, but yet you can't really grow very fast because your people are not skilled enough. They lack the necessary skills to support that growth. So if universities want to turn their graduates into nothing but book-oriented graduates, that won't do. So he emphasized skills development and vocational, technical, engineering, for example, is a discipline that he picked on as well. So these are things that he emphasizes to invest in human capital, but also invest in human capital in a way that supports growth. Okay, these MNCs are talked about. And of course, the stable and corruption-free environment. When Albert Winsemius came to Singapore, the first thing he told the then founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew was that, well, he saw a lot of the ultra-leftist radical demonstration, riots, these type of things, agitators on the streets. So he says, well, we can't have all this. If you want a country to grow and grow well, it must it must come with a calm, peaceful, and political environment, right? If you don't have that, forget it, right? So nothing can really take off when you have all these at stake, right? So, of course, the leaders of the time also agreed that we can't have a situation where where all this unrest and social unrest everywhere, right? So we need to try to mitigate, reduce this in order to have focus on economic growth and development. And so I want to focus on this part here. In summary, Winsemius' important contributions in Singapore were prioritizing the manufacturing sector, improving labor, industrial, and international trade relations. That's why he suggests the National Wages Council and the setup of a one-stop place called the Economic Development Board. Now, this is important, this too, because in order to support this growth, he also believes in the tripartism between the government on the one hand, the employers, and then the employees. There must be cooperation and understanding what's happening to the labor market. So whenever they want to make wage policies to increase or decrease, whatever, they have this group to discuss with, gets everybody's agreement. So again, there will be no social unrest in the labor sector. And Economic Development Board is important because it's the institution, the organization in Singapore that he promoted together with Dr. Goh Keng Swee, which is to focus on bringing in foreign direct investment, and it's a one-stop place, right, for all those connected with foreign direct investment. And later on, he says, well, if EDB grows up, then the different functions of the EDB, for example, on the finance side, on the infrastructure side, all this can be passed off into new agencies. So from the Economic Development Board, sprung off DBS Bank, sprung off Jurong Town Corporation, JTC, and so on and so forth. So this came from one agency called Economic Development Board. So he started this. Competitive prices and wage levels, where we talked about the changing circumstances from a full employment to one that moves on to a higher value-added economy, therefore changing in the wage structure, attracting foreign investment, human capital, promoting productivity, reducing reliance on unskilled foreign labor, low-cost labor-intensive to higher value economy, Sentosa, and this global financial center is very interesting too, because he noticed that when the market shuts down in Europe, then the New York or the US market opens up. So in between, there's opportunity for Singapore to fill in this gap. And so that's what he recommended. And later on, Singapore has a financial hub. All this because of his recommendation to focus on this need for Singapore to provide. When one market closed down and before the market opens up, Singapore can fulfill this. So there's continuation. So what it means for Singapore's future, does Albert Winsemius is still valid? Well, we are living in an age of uncertainty and complexity. So of course, some of these ideas of his, the pragmatism aspects, adaptability aspects, be nimble, be able to change directions quickly, all these things are found in the book, but these are his part of his pragmatic skills and recommendations. Market failure state for intervention. Well, when we use the market as an allocation of scarce resources, economists always like to use the market. But he also while he advocated the market guiding principles to allocate scarce resources, he was also aware, very much aware, that the market also cannot do everything, and there are what we call market failures, right? So, for example, the income disparity, right? So, and other externalities like pollution, all these things, where the market cannot produce desirable outcomes. So you need state intervention. So he's not against the intervention. It's just that he wants markets to be the guiding principles, but also knows the market failures and therefore how to deal with this and through state intervention. He talks about the need to attract and retain human capital. So it's not just attracting good talents to come to Singapore, but how to retain them in Singapore. What are the things that are needed? Ensuring industrial harmony and a stable political climate, which I talked earlier. And last but not least, he argued that economic growth is just a means and not an end in itself. So a country is trying to grow, achieve good jobs, employment, income for its citizens. But is that it? No. There must be more than it. And that's what we call the quality of life. So after economic growth, where does society heads to? A higher quality of life, right? So what determines the higher quality of life? So these are things that he talked about. Now, this is a quote from Lee Kuan Yew. It was Singapore's good fortune that he took a deep and personal interest in Singapore's development. Singapore and I personally are indebted to him for time, energy, and devotion that he gave to Singapore. Now, this is also another interesting quote from him directly. And he tells you this, which is that, is Singapore really a miracle? His argument is no, it's not a miracle. It's all hard work, hard policy, meaning that the leaders of the time need to think what constitutes good economic policy. It's not like wishful thinking. It's not magic. It just not happen by chance. You have to work for it. And he said all this. So what happened in Singapore was not a miracle, it was policy. Now, connected with this, I also I want to bring out this statement, which is that Mr. Peter Ho is our Singapore's former top civil servant, chief of the Singapore Public Service, and he once said, "Policy is implementation." So you design a policy, you want to implement good policy, but implementation is also policy. They are connected, the two. And why they're connected? Because sometimes when you design policies, may be good, but then when you implement it, it's very hard for people to follow your policy. That's what we call high transaction costs in economics, right? So you need to find the ease of which to ease and understanding of these government policies. So policy implementation is policy, right? Now here I come to a very quick snapshot of Singapore and Penang. Again, I'm not a strong, keen Penang watcher. Now, both are multicultural states with diverse ethnicities, cultures, languages, and religion. Both are relatively small land areas. Singapore, 735.7 square kilometers, and Penang is 1,000 square kilometers. If you include the mainland part of Penang, then Penang is bigger than Singapore. But if you take out the mainland part, then Penang Island is smaller than Singapore Island. They are both attractive to foreign direct investment. And this is you can see the differences. Services, 73% of GDP. In Singapore, manufacturing is only 19%. But in Penang, services 48%. And manufacturing is 46%. Relatively good job prospect, attracting people to come to work in Singapore and live in Singapore. Penang, there's a relatively weaker, and you have suffered from brain drain issues. I mean, this is a reality. And not just Penang, many countries also suffer from brain drain. Then Singapore has a calm political stability, certainty, clean government, and you have a problem with not a problem, but you have to deal with this constraint, right? Penang and federal government, because you have provinces. Malaysia is a country with many states, right? So there's a state to federal relationship, but Singapore doesn't have that. So it's one city-state, one country. So there are big differences in that sense, but there are also similarities. Penang's strengths and challenges, as I see it, it has an established electronic sector, a cultural heritage, rising tourism, and human capital. But it faces challenges such as urban inequality, brain drain, traffic congestion these days. My time when I was living here, nothing, no issue. But now traffic congestion is horrendous. Climate vulnerability, island, state. And sometimes you get inconsistent urban planning just from observations. So what are some of the key lessons I think one can think about relating urban Winsemius to Penang? One is, in the case of Winsemius and the Singapore strategy, we focus on industrial policy and MNC attraction. Now, this, of course, implications on the Penang. Application here, knowing this, is to strengthen the electronics and electrical sector while climbing up the value chains. Investment in human capital in the Winsemius Singapore strategy. Well, then I understand that in Malaysia you have this technical, vocational, right? E is what? Educational and training, right? So align this and power the universities with future industries. Urban planning and public housing, well, more or less the same thing, making it more affordable housing and green infrastructure. National branding, investor trust. That's another thing about Winsemius, that it's important to establish trust between government and the people, and also with corporations. I want to I miss out one thing about, if you go to Singapore, you'll catch the statue of Sir Stamford Raffles, the founder of modern Singapore. Now, in many countries with a colonial past, they will tend to erase off everything that's colonialism. They can't wait to be wiped it off. It's a bad part of their history and so on. But Singapore was very comfortable with this, in a sense, accepting this past. It's not something you can change. It's happened, right? And there's some impacts on it to Singapore. And so we accepted it. And so he recommended to Singapore at the time not to take down the statue of Sir Stamford Raffles, which was sitting in some northern part near the Singapore River. Leave it there. His point is that this sends a very strong signal to the outside world. At that time, the outside world, meaning the Western countries, right? With the know-how, the technology, the finance, and so on. So it tells them that we are comfortable with our historic past, we accept it, and we would like to encourage, the signal is to send a message, encourage them to come and invest in Singapore, work with Singapore, grow Singapore. Right? So that's very different from many of the countries which have this colonial past. They, in a sense that instead of embracing, instead of accepting, right? So they go all out to destroy this historical aspect. And therefore, they may create this distrust, right, between these Western countries and who, as I said at that time, were the more of the developed countries, right? And we need their help, right? But so in Singapore, we took a different course. So in the Penang's case, I guess improving regulatory clarity, accountability, and this, move on. And we need to avoid what we call the cookie cutter solutions. In other words, we customize lessons from Singapore to Penang's local context and unique cultural dynamics. We must involve stakeholders, like what Winsemius has said, ensure civil society and industry representatives participate. The more the stakeholders of a country participate in what is at stake, essentially, the more they understand, the more they get the rationale for why government is doing certain things, the more they will work with you rather than against you and sowing seeds of discord, right? They will trust you. And this would build on to a wide support and legitimacy. So concluding message here is that policymakers should adopt the Winsemius-inspired Singaporean approach, forward-looking yet pragmatic, ambitious yet inclusive, to position Penang not just as a competitive economic hub, but as a sustainable, livable, and globally attractive city region. Basically, Winsemius have argued that growing is one thing, but you have to also make the place livable and good infrastructure, right? Clean. All these things will attract and retain your talents. People come to Singapore, they want to stay there. They want to live there. So that's very important, that this aspect be part of your growth process. Oh, this is what he's obtained from the National Archives. I think that is, generally speaking, the philosophy of this type of work. You work for people you don't know, for people who even don't exist today, people who will never know what you did or tried to do. Nevertheless, it is highly satisfactory. And I felt that, as I said, 3 times in my life, which may be not much, but I have the impression often people less fortunate do not have that possibility at all. I had 3. Singapore is the most pleasant. And how do I do this? Press next slide. Press twice. No. Go back. Press. No.
I think that is
Louder.
speaking. The philosophy of this type of work. You work for people you don't know,
Cannot.
for people who
Maybe you
don't
use the mic.
exist
Close
today. People will never know what you did or tried to do. Nevertheless, it is highly satisfactory. And I found that, as I said, 3 times in my life, which might be not much, but I have the impression often people less fortunate do not have that possibility at all. And 3, Singapore is the most pleasant.
In the archives, oral archives. He's a very strong accented English at the time, but he's a Dutchman, yeah. And but basically, what he said was this statement that I put up: his satisfaction as an advisor to a foreign country whose people don't know, and those people who don't even born yet, but he's very satisfying that he's doing some good for the country. Okay, I think with that, this is just nothing but the book launch itself, which I did in Singapore. Some pictures on the book launch, and you can see this is the son of Albert Winsemius. He was a minister in the Dutch cabinet. He's giving me a cheese because the family of the Winsemius, they actually make cheese, cheese factory. Most of the family of the Winsemius flew out from Netherlands for this event. And it was launched by Deputy Prime Minister Heng Swee Keat. Okay, so thank you very much for this short talk that I gave. I hope I give you some understanding of what Albert Winsemius, who Albert Winsemius was, and what did he do for the country of Singapore, and what are some of the key takeaways that he did, and how these key takeaways can influence other countries. You cannot copy or imitate, but you can adapt. That's a key point. You can adapt to some of these lessons. All right, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Have a seat. Right. Right. Thank you for the inspiring and insightful sharing. So I prepared questions. Well, I will go with one question first, then I'll open up to the floor. Right. So you mentioned about good infrastructures and also clean government is one of the success factors in Singapore, right? And Winsemius also emphasized that we need to build the institutional capacities. We need to have a local context, right? Adapt it to the local context. But for Penang to truly learn from this, what are the most significant institutional or systemic changes that Penang would need to make to effectively translate the Winsemius pragmatic approach into actionable policies for long-term competitiveness and also livability?
Thank you, Willing. I can think of 5 drawing from the Winsemius lessons. You know, Singapore embraces the world basically. But by doing that, it's also a very open economy. And I think same as Penang, they are both small city-states in the center, both very vulnerable to external environment, right? And how they respond to it. So in the case of Winsemius, he talked about this not to shy away from the global environment. In fact, you should even embrace and be more open-minded about it. Right? So foreign direct investment, of course, is a must. And so this will be the same, I think, with Singapore. So these pragmatic aspects to open up and to be more in tune with the global environment, and not to resort to insular looking protectionism and so on and so forth, would benefit both Penang and Singapore. I think the second one is human capital. We talked about human capital investments, skills, and the continuation, I think, of skills upgrading. So Penang, of course, has now grown very fast, and we're in a different kind of Penang is not Singapore in the 1960s. It's grown already. So then what is the next thing that you need to do? Well, you need to focus on raising your productivity, and you need to upgrade skills to see what the market demands globally and so on. There's a changing market, the changing world. So you cannot be stuck with old skills. So investment or education is very important. I think the one thing good about Singapore is a good time or bad time. Singapore never fails when it comes to continued support for education. And then upgrading, diversification of industries, looking for new markets and not be just stagnated with one. And if there is a change and then you don't change with it, so you have to adapt, you have to be nimble, you have to keep strong lookout. And Winsemius is that kind of person. He was actually he was very evidence-based and data-driven. I think being an economist, that's what we don't want details which are unnecessary information. What we want is evidence-based. We need to collect data and so on. So his collection of data is not just looking at GDP growth, and that's important, but not the end all and be all. So he will look at, for example, there was a story about him wanting vacancies on jobs, So you look at how that number, that he gives you a perception of how our job market is like, and that also have a important implication for the economy. So when he was back in Holland, he would ask for Straits Times, and you look at the job vacancy, page in the Straits Times. And then from that, you see how the density of the job vacancies, and then he makes some impression out of it. But the point is that he constantly monitors the pulse of the economy through this way. I think there's also I mentioned earlier about strengthening some institutions that you have. So while we have the EDB, and now EDB has there are other new agencies such as Enterprise Singapore. But I'm sure in Penang you have from what I read, I'm not a Penang watcher, but in the past I've read about like Invest Penang, and then there's Penang Development Corporation. So you need to strengthen, give a lot of autonomy to these institutions, as what we have done with the Economic Development Board in Singapore. Empower them. And going with economic growth, I think there has to be livability. So that's also important about urban livability. So you attract and you retain your talents. And at the same time, you ensure that the society has a higher quality of life along the way, not just grow for growth's sake. Okay.
That's why it is so important for a policy to be translated into a good implementations, right? Effective implementations. Now, I think I will take questions from the floor. Is there any questions? Please state your name and your organization if you have.
I'm a retiree here in Penang. Professor Kwa, you mentioned that Dr. Goh Keng Swee then was the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore. He was very much in the forefront of Singapore's industrialization, and I can assume that Dr. Goh Keng Swee worked very closely with Dr. Winsemius. After Dr. Goh retired from government, he became a consultant to the Chinese government, and I think he helped the Chinese government in developing the southern states of China. Would you say that China indirectly, through Dr. Goh, benefited from Dr. Winsemius' economic ideas?
Well, okay. I want to qualify one thing, which is that it is not a one-man show all along. So when Winsemius came, he was the role as an advisor. He was a sounding board to some of these ideas that floated around with the top leaders of the time. And I mentioned that Dr. Goh was the architect of Singapore's modern economy. And that is a fact. And he and Minister Hon Swee Sen, all the players of the time, and he basically, there was a synergy. There was a synergy between the advisor, which is Dr. Albert Winsemius, and the leaders of the time. Without this synergy of ideas, I don't think any advisor will be able to take off to his suggestions for the country. And this is exactly what happened to Arthur Lewis, the Nobel Prize from Princeton, when he advised some African country. He basically, there's a difference in modus operandi. In the case of this Arthur Lewis, there was from what I read, there was differences in his ideas with that of the leaders, and basically the whole thing just fall apart because you need the support of the political leaders to act in unison with your ideas, and that did not happen in his case, as is the case in many advisors. But Winsemius' case, they happened beautifully, and that's why the country took off. Now, you asked about the question of Dr. Goh Keng Swee going over to China and assisting in some advice to the Chinese government. I think that's probably quite true. He, of course, gave some valuable insights to China. But the thing is, China is a very big country with different kind of resources and different kinds of challenges compared to a smaller states. And the need from the Chinese side may be slightly different and more demanding than what we could offer. But nevertheless, he did offer and work in tandem with the Chinese. Chinese did work with him in tandem. They set up some of the projects, right, in the southern part of China, as you said. And I think they just celebrated their, I don't know what anniversary they had with some of the success from that project. So did Albert Winsemius contribute to this? One cannot tell for sure, but I think at that time in the 60s when Albert Winsemius was working with Dr. Goh Keng Swee, basically all these ideas would have been discussed about how to grow the economy and how to do it in a smooth way. I wouldn't know for sure whether this indirect relationship did help, but of course, intuitively, one would expect that the ideas are good enough for them in Singapore's case. They might be somewhat good enough for China, but I add that additional clause, which is the demands from China will be quite different because it's a very big country with different sets of challenges.
Okay. Next questions? The gentleman.
Hello? Oh, well, I'm also a retiree in Penang. And my question is that I understand that initially the policy in Singapore was importing a lot of experts and brains from other countries, which included Mr. or Dr. Winsemius. But I understand that now, maybe owing to the fact that you're using more efforts with the capacity and investing in that and the local capacity, that these foreign experts are not so needed so much, because in my experience, I have a friend of mine who works in Singapore, and he says that there are a lot of jobs for the foreigners are now being cut owing to that. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, one has to be following this. I mean, this is basically the perception that people have, but I don't know because you need to be a Singapore watcher and you need to have all this data in order to say what you want to say. So the short answer to that is I don't really know. Another question.
Okay, that's another question at the gentleman.
Thank you. Continuing on this gentleman's question, I understand that Singapore continues to attract skilled, highly skilled and talented foreign expertise. Whereas in one of your slides, the strategies advocated was non-reliance on unskilled foreign labor. Now, Malaysia is currently, we are having about 3.1 million unskilled foreign labor. So is the Malaysian government, do you think, is on the wrong economic trajectory? And what is your advice? Thank you.
Well, I'm not here to give advice to the government of Malaysia. I'm just trying to relate what Albert Winsemius has done primarily for Singapore. I don't even know, for example, you mentioned this data on the unskilled labor, and I don't know what is the trend of that. I also don't know relative to the unskilled versus the skilled. I think basically the countries need both unskilled and skilled along the years. But what we need is in the past, because the economy of the past is different from the economy today. So therefore, there are changes in the economic structure of the country. There are changes, therefore, to the needs of the labor that go with it, both skilled and unskilled. So it depends on the context of each country. So I don't know the Malaysian situation well, because you're referring to the entire country or even Penang. But the short answer to this is that we do need both skilled and unskilled. How big the size is, it depends upon the changing circumstances of your economy. So somebody needs to study, have the economy change and so on, and are we therefore moving out of one type to another type? But again, as the country progresses and become more developed, the skilled workers will become much more needed in order to support further growth in the economy and this adapting to changes. So if you are stuck with unskilled, you basically get a different kind of economy. You are stuck in the past, and then you just don't move, basically. And lots of unskilled workers means you depress wages for everyone. You don't want that. And also, you do not embrace technological substitution, the new technology that would raise productivity. So that's another thing that would happen if you have lots of unskilled workers. But again, I must emphasize, a country needs both skilled and unskilled, right?
Okay. Any more question? If no, I continue. Right. So I guess, I mean, the compositions of unskilled or skill level, I think we still need that, because the countries for a country to develop, we need a certain portion, certain proportions of the unskilled workers to support, to do some 3D jobs that are not really taken up, like mostly are taken up by the foreigners, right? In the case of Malaysia, right? I believe in the case of Singapore, it's a mix of both, right? So, but the key things is about, like, I like your presentations that you have one line is about that Dr. Albert Winsemius mentions about something about that we need to have we need to have a grand strategy, but at the same time, the strategy must be able to adapt to the local context, right? Despite what kind of theories that we apply, right? So, but the thing is, how can we, in the case of Malaysia, I think there are many similarities in the case of Penang, but the only thing I think the big difference is in terms of the structures of the governance is different, right? The structure of the governance is one way is very quite different. But maybe could you maybe I think in Singapore we have a lot of in Singapore is also is a global trade centers. In Penang itself, actually we contributed a lot of a percentage, in our exports, especially from the E&E sectors. So in a way, we are also quite vulnerable to the global headwinds, right? But then one thing to say is that you have mentioned with the global headwinds, we need to prepare ourselves better, which is through the human capital developments, increase our productivities. But what are the principles from the Winsemius models that we can learn from in order for us to mitigate risks like the economic shocks, like for example, the tariff from Trump policies, and so on?
Trump policies affects everybody, Oh, there's a Liberation Day, right? Yeah, I think it's Liberation Day for for US. I guess the important thing is that we have always got to be mindful of things change. So it's always not rosy all the time, and being an economy that is very vulnerable to the external environment, being very open. Penang, like Singapore, has to be looking for other markets, continuously searching for diversification of industries and also looking at other markets. And what Trump has done is to provide catalysts for this movement, for this search. And I think that's important, so that we don't always need to rely on only one market, and we need to look into, now perhaps we can look at ASEAN, the ASEAN market, And also note that the impact on China, like semiconductors, all this, they have shifted the attention to ASEAN. So ASEAN could be an alternative, So there are opportunities because Penang is also into these chips and semiconductor industries. There are opportunities in the ASEAN market and opportunities, I think, opportunities in South America, opportunities in Africa, to intensify all this search process and diversify. I think that's a key for open, small, vulnerable states. Other thing is that I think I want to mention that Albert Winsemius did say that after he doesn't want Singapore to be just a manufacturing base. He also wants Singapore to be a thinking place, and that's connected to investment in human capital and attracting and retaining talents. How to promote further innovation and creativity, and that's where the state comes in to provide more support for this kind of activities of research and development and so on. So I think for countries like Singapore and states like Penang, we should focus on this thinking idea, not just focusing on providing jobs, income, but rather looking further down a few, right? Such as I read somewhere something like instead of made in instead of made in Penang, it's made by Penang. Somebody refers to that. I think that's a good idea, and I think Singapore is trying to do that as well. The other things I already said more or less cover in the first question that you answered, so I don't want to repeat them.
Okay. Any question from the floor? The gentleman in front.
Now, this gentleman here is Philip Yeo, and he is my oldest classmate. Now, you may think classmate means what? Primary school? No, kindergarten.
Okay, Dr. Houston, I actually like to bring us back to one part of your presentation on how Dr. Winsemius came to the idea that actually Singapore should now raise wages by what was that, 20%? And that literally made the leaders of that time worried, right? It came right after you demonstrated that Dr. Winsemius also presided over shifts in Singapore's economy. He thought that maybe there should be less over-reliance on the entrepot, moving Singapore into the ship-breaking industry from where all the other spin-offs came. And after that phrase, he just decided that Singapore should start paying its workers more. Now, normally the standard thinking is that it should be a cost up sort of thing. Wages should be a cost up process, a product of a cost up process. In other words, when work starts getting expensive, then wages go up. But now he seemed to have approached it in the opposite direction. Or we should raise people's wages first. Is that how it happened? And if so, what were the circumstances during that time that allowed Singapore to get away with that?
Okay, it shows that my classmate is paying attention. Anyway, again, to keep this short, well, the point is that with too much labor supply available in the 60s, right? So you need to find jobs for them and so on, right? But if you have this easily available foreign supply of workers, compounding this excess workers in the labor economy, the wage rate will be low. And when the wage rate is low, productivity is low. So you need to turn things around for two reasons. One is that you want to, and I said earlier, move up the value chain, which means you will need to raise productivity. So one way to force companies sort of to accept that they're going not to have easy access to excess labor or supply is to have this wage change. And 20% is high for consecutive 3 years. So it's like a shock to the system in anticipation of one, raising productivity, two, raising the value chain, and three, to send a signal that you don't depend on all this excess foreign supply of labor. Right? But more importantly is this, which is to transform the economy. So to embrace more higher technological stuff, right? Instead of just getting more and more work, remaining stuck in a labor-intensive economy. You want to move up to a capital-intensive economy. You want to use new technology into the labor force, and so on. So all these things, changing the wage structure. One is to catch up. Number two is to ensure that you transform the economy by providing this catalyst. So this is something which people worry at that time, as you rightly expressed some of these concerns. But Albert Winsemius took a different view. He is very convinced that this is the way to restructure the economy.
Yeah. Okay. We have another questions from Tony.
Actually, this question comes in from a viewer in Australia. He's a ex-Penang, right? And his question is, with mainland, we have an advantage over Singapore. What do you think Winsemius would advise Penang given our comparative advantage over Singapore?
But this is assuming that, assuming that we can, that I know about the Penang economy very well, which I said at the beginning, I qualified that I do not. But more importantly, yes, he is right, that the Penang has a hinterland, which is Malaysia, and Singapore doesn't have. And that also springs up to my, I remember when I was doing research on Albert Winsemius, when Singapore was out of Malaysia, there was a big worry, because before that, the thinking was that we can have some sort of a custom market together with Malaysia. So two markets can merge, and there will be, Malaysia would act like a hinterland also for selling the Singapore-based goods and so on. But when Singapore is out of that federation, right, of the merger, right, is out, then Singapore is independent, have to find other sources of markets. And so that forces the Singapore leaders to cast their net wider. It means the world, the region all become the market and not necessarily tie into the Malaysian market. So there was and Winsemius was actually very happy that actually that this forces the leaders to look wider rather than looking at Malaysian market. But yes, a hinterland makes a big difference, because in times of bad times, right, in bad times of the global economy, at least you have a bigger domestic market to sort of shelter you, to minimize the impact. So if you think about China is a big domestic market, right? Whereas if you're looking at Singapore and then Penang, if you don't have that hinterland, then we have a more challenging aspects to try to protect the economy against these external forces. But in the case of Penang, at least you have Malaysia as a hinterland and providing the domestic market. Does he have another question from Australia? Oh, he has. Oh. Is he our classmate? Yes. Really? Oh, that is no public secret that we, it makes sense because Johor is our closest neighbor, right? And Johor has a lot of land opportunities for Singaporean businesses to engage in, and at the cost of doing business is lower in Johor. And so it is a mutual gains between Johor and Singapore to have this collaboration. And now they are expanding, they are improving a lot of the public infrastructure, especially transport infrastructure, and access into each other's countries. I think that is good because it's win-win situation for both. And I think it's high time that both sides stand to gain from this mutual collaboration. I cannot think of anything really bad about this collaboration. Does he have a third question?
I think I can take a head count of the number of your classmates are here.
This section over here.
Oh, okay.
Only this
Quite a number of them.
This side.
Okay, any more question? Otherwise, we will close. No? No more questions. Okay, you can catch up with Professor Kwa later on after this talk. Right? Thank you so much, Professor Houston Kwa.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Nice, a lot of familiar faces from past talks. So thank you all for coming again to my talk. Thank you. And we should thank.